Tanya Plibersek and John Faulkner, as I understand at the moment, are, as we speak, at a fundraising event on the central coast of New South Wales. So apologise for being unable to be here, other than in a recorded video form. Tanya's unable to, as it were, to phone in and contribute. John's in the same position. And Lindsay Tanner also had a commitment at exactly this time. So we're going to see 3 videos from Tanya, from John Faulkner and from Lindsay Tanner. And then I'll ask Kim Carr and Jeff Gallop to speak, and then hope we can get a conversation going around that question I was posing. So can I leave it to you to...
I'm really very sorry I couldn't be with you all to remember Stuart McIntyre today. I know his death was felt around the country, and it was certainly felt very deeply inside the Australian Labor Party. You only have to look through the program to see the breadth of Stuart's influence on Australian life. He was a true public intellectual, a beautiful writer, a generous friend and mentor, and a great man of the left. Percy Shelley once described poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Well, I'd say that Stuart was an unacknowledged legislator in Australian political life. Not many people can claim that kind of influence, what the university administrators these days would call impact. But his work on post-war reconstruction has really genuinely shaped this country's understanding of the current pandemic as well. It's shaped our picture of how recovery should work. I was lucky enough to speak with Stuart several times in the last few years, and his work on post-war reconstruction has been a big influence on my thinking. And I think also the thinking of the wider Labor caucus. I asked him to host a book club meeting with federal Labor MPs to discuss Australia's boldest experiment. And he was so generous and willing to do that, and so lovely and gracious with his time, because he really did want people to understand his work. He wanted us to understand the possibilities of government, of what visionary leadership can accomplish. Out of the darkest of days, after a global crisis, his book offers the best portrait of those Curtin Chifley years, the great Labor project, an active and humane government run by working people with the interests of working people at its heart. A government that won the war and then went on to give everyone a job, that built the houses that people needed to live in, that extended the social security safety net for the vulnerable, that initiated the work that became 3 decades of continuous economic growth under later Labor governments. Stuart's work didn't preach, it inspired through the power of the example that it was offering. And that example still shines brightly today. It shows us what Australians can be at our best. Creative, ambitious, egalitarian, a united country forging our own destiny. It's my great hope that some of Stuart's example can be implemented after the election in May. It would be a fitting coda to Stuart's lifetime of work. I know that he will be missed by countless people, and I send my deepest regards to his family and friends at this really difficult time. But while he's missed, he won't be forgotten. As long as his books remain on our shelves, as long as they offer lessons to the problems of today, as long as there are Australians fighting for a better, fairer world, Stuart McIntyre will be remembered and his legacy will live on. Thank you, Stuart, for everything that you have given us.
Friends, in early 1999, I rang Stuart McIntyre and asked if he would mind if I came down to Melbourne to chat with him about the plans that were developing in Canberra to celebrate the centenary of Federation. At the centre of parliamentary celebrations were ceremonial sittings on the 9th and 10th of May 2001 to commemorate the inauguration of the Parliament at the Royal Exhibition Building on the 9th of May 1901 and the first sitting of both houses of the Parliament a day later. Why did I call Stuart? Well, Stuart was our country's preeminent Labor historian, and I wanted to speak to him about how we might celebrate the centenary of the formation of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, a momentous event occurring the day before Parliament assembled. Stuart, ever generous, was keen to meet. We caught up in his office at the University of Melbourne. I asked if he would be able to nominate someone from the fraternity of Labor historians who would consider working on a centenary history of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. Stuart took no time to consider. His response was immediate and magnificent. He told me he thought this was a project commemorating a very significant milestone in Australia's political history. He was eager to be involved himself. That afternoon, we began developing a plan to tell the story of the caucus through a single-volume book of essays, tracking caucus successes and failures across the century. Within weeks, our plan was in place. We would jointly edit 11 narrative chapters and 7 thematic chapters, as well as include reflections from the 5 men living at the time who had led the Federal Party. Apart from Stuart and myself, we had to find another 16 contributors to write substantial essays. My task was to corral Canberra Press Gallery leaders, our party leader and former party leaders. Stuart was to enlist eminent scholars of history and political science. Stuart stressed that this work was an opportunity for some talented, up-and-coming Labor historians to make a mark. I saw then firsthand how important it was to him to encourage and mentor younger colleagues. More than 20 years later, 2 of those colleagues, Frank Bongiorno and Sean Scalmer, are also speaking at this symposium. A series of meetings in Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra followed with each of our contributors. Stuart found 1 or 2 of those meetings a far cry from the more collegiate meetings at Melbourne University he was accustomed to. I remember one meeting in my office in Canberra. There was Stuart, this gifted, gracious, tolerant man, creatively and calmly guiding discussion with our Canberra-based contributors, pipe in hand. Enter gallery journalist Alan Ramsey, who it's fair to say did not always exhibit those same qualities. Time was tight. We had no flexibility with our deadlines. The launch date for the book was the date of the centenary of the formation of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. It was locked in stone. It had been for 100 years. Now, Ramseyan deadlines often did not coincide. Ramseyan pressure did not mix. Stuart watched on as Ramsey and I let fly. It's fair to say some of the words we exchanged that day were comprised of only 4 letters. After the Ramsey meeting concluded, I remember Stuart Riley saying something along the lines of, "Oh, that went well." Another meeting with our publisher, John Iremonger, in Sydney was memorable. Stuart had convinced John to write a chapter on Labor rats. That's the old-fashioned rodent, not the current variety which we're desperate to find at a local chemist. John was a very accomplished publisher, but proved to be a very tardy contributor. He also failed to meet our strict deadlines. In the end, John produced a fine chapter, but these experiences led Stuart and John to dissuade no one from the growing perception that Stuart's co-editor had established what came to be described as Faulkner's reign of terror. But this reign of terror worked in our favour when a couple of factional mediocrities came along to the small caucus committee dealing with the centenary. It was obvious to them the McIntyre-Faulkner problem, or if you like, the left-wing, if not closet communist takeover of the caucus centenary had to be dealt with. Even worse, undesirables, of which the aforementioned Ramsay was an excellent example, were writing chapters in the caucus history. I might say when this was happening, Stuart had already chalked up many years of continuous membership of the Australian Labor Party, first joining the West Australian branch of the party in the late 1970s, then the Victorian branch in the mid-1980s. As far as the caucus insurrection was concerned, it lasted only a few minutes before the apocryphal guillotine fell. Yes, those couple of characters were treated like enemies of the revolution. Friends, Stuart and I worked together for 2 years to produce a book with the title True Believers, the story of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. Working with Stuart, learning from Stuart, benefiting from his scholarship and professionalism were highlights of my time in public life. It was in every sense an honour for me to collaborate on a history project with Stuart McIntyre. I'm not sure that I have the words to adequately describe how much I admired Stuart. He was genuinely a man of principle. He was the most elegant of writers. He was a great Australian historian. He generously enabled many of us to benefit from his intellect and his wisdom. His death is truly a great loss to our nation.
G'day, my name's Lindsay Tanner. I was privileged to have Stuart McIntyre as the supervisor for both my honours thesis and my master's thesis, with assistance from John Lack for a period when Stuart was overseas. I also had quite a bit to do with him as a Member of Parliament because for most of that time he lived and was active in the Labor Party in my electorate. In more recent years I haven't seen much of him because of moving into different spheres. Mostly when I did catch up with Stuart it was at Essendon Hawthorn games, which in that period were usually pretty character building for we Essendon supporters. But I was fortunate to have a long conversation with him only a few months ago at a period when his illness was in better shape. And as was typical of the kind of conversations that you tended to have with Stuart, it ranged over a very wide number of topics, including 19th century European history and the administration of AFL football clubs. And there are a few laughs along the way. I'm very sad that we have lost Stuart. He's somebody who had a profound influence on me and, looking back, a major influence on my intellectual development. He was always insightful, always generous, always courteous, and very, very constructive. and as a supervisor and as a guide, always gave you space to evolve, to develop, but with guide rails, with guidance, and always unfailingly common sense and great assistance. But possibly where he was more important is as an intellectual guide for people on the left who had very difficult challenges to face in the 80s and 90s as the intellectual underpinnings of socialism crumbled and the Soviet Union collapsed. Many people on the left retreated into fundamentalism, others surrendered and effectively announced that the right had been correct all along. It was very challenging for those of us who didn't want to do either, but we always had as a guide the intellectual heft of Stuart McIntyre, who enabled us, I think, to carve out a coherent position in extremely challenging times when the left was on the defensive everywhere. And I always remember Stuart's address to the Labor Party National Conference at the peak period of right-wing dominance, and where the notion that there might be some kind of program or serious transformational purpose in the Labor Party, his phrase, "True believers need beliefs." It encapsulated, I think, what the Labor Party was lacking or missing at the time, and which enabled people on the left to find a path forward to future relevance. So Vale, Stuart McIntyre, a fantastic historian, somebody whose books are great to read, and I'm just about to read his most recent one, The Party, and also a great intellectual influence on me and many others. Thank you.
Those three recorded contributions. Can I ask Senator Kim Carter come forward now? I'm not going to bother running through all of Kim's many achievements and appointments, but note as he advances to the podium that he was for 3 or 4 months Minister for Higher Education.
A few others.
Plenty of others, certainly, but that one I think was particularly relevant for us. I've got some water just coming in.
I've also was the Minister for Science and Research, which is quite important in regard to the work that Stuart undertook. Can I just indicate to you, my remarks should be seen as supplementary to the remarks that I made in the Senate chamber in early December on the question of Stuart's contribution to Australia. Just indicate to you, I regard Stuart certainly as a mentor for me. By way of background, I should suggest to you that he supervised my MA research thesis, which was on left-wing mobilisation in the Labor Party in the 1930s. And since I was Secretary of the Socialist Left at the time, the subject wasn't merely a matter of academic interest. In fact, it's become a bit of a lifelong project. His books were influential in shaping my understanding of Australian history and politics. He was always valued as wise counsel. He wasn't just, however, a collaborator. He was a friend and comrade. Now, comrade is a word that I use to describe that bond between people who strive towards a common goal. Stuart and I were comrades as members of the Labor Party and as members of the Socialist Left. For Stuart, comrade was a word that also expressed the unity between his work as a historian and his political activism. It is sometimes said that as historians prefer a quiet life. I don't think that could be said of Stuart. He was not frightened to engage with our political opponents. He regarded the historical inquiries in which he was engaged as having implications for life that he lived. And he acted accordingly. And to understand that is to grasp the essential continuity in Stuart's endeavours, both his scholarly and his political work. It's a mistake, for example, to see his decision not to rejoin the Communist Party of Australia after he returned from Cambridge and to recommence with the ALP as a rupture in his thinking. Stuart, in my judgment, never abandoned a Marxist perspective, but he was never dogmatic or rigid in his understanding of what moved society or people. He chose to join the Victorian branch of the Labor Party because it was a better vehicle in which he could work for political and social change. Stuart was a frequent contributor to Socialist Objective, which was a magazine which was circulating within the socialist left in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, in the edition of July 1993, 2 years after the CP had been dissolved and 7 years after he became a member of the Victorian branch, he described his former allegiance in this way. I quote, "I'm fairly dry-eyed about the passing of communism. When comrade history says your time is up, there's little point in arguing." Stuart was also quite dry-eyed, however, about the Labor Party, in which he had committed himself. And this is how he compared the ALP and the CP in a conversation with Bernie Taff, a former CPA National Secretary and Victorian State Committee member, who he said in the 1980s, "I joined the Labor Party and I was active for a few years in the Socialist Left. Then there, I thought the quality of political discussion was abysmal. I was used to the branch meetings in the Communist Party of Great Britain, where you discuss matters in a systematic, reasoned and analytical way. I've never been to a Labor Party meeting where there's a discussion of any great penetration." It's a little harsh, but now such sentiments perhaps suggest that he was less than enthusiastic as a member of the Labor Party. And I say he remained financial up until the time of his death. It is remarkable, therefore, that he involved himself in the party at all levels, at the branch level, the local members, federal members of parliament, state members of parliament, explained to me just how he was engaged with them and with Labor Party members. He would be engaged not just at the local level, right through to the national conferences John Faulkner's outlined. Stuart contributed to the policy formation, especially with regards to higher education and to research policy. He was always generous with his time, I think as a number of speakers have highlighted. He was, however, always quick to defend the party and the Labor movement, no matter how powerful the opponents. For instance, he chaired the Bias is Bad News campaign in 1992, which took on the Herald Sun and the might of the Murdoch empire. And I think it was an incredibly generous and courageous thing to do as a history professor at Melbourne University. Many of you will be familiar with the leadership, of course, that he undertook nationally in regard to civics and the controversy that that engendered. The group's report in '94 was a national conversation, and a conversation that I think continues through to today. Now, he championed the values that underpin the left throughout all of those conversations. Shortly before he died, he was the chair of the committee, was commemorating the 66 Australians who fought against fascism in the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War. But I say, and I want to echo the remarks that Lindsay Tanner made, by far his biggest contribution was to keep alive the aspirations of the left during a period when we were under such intense attack, not just inside the Labor Party, but within the country as a whole. In the early 80s, when the Labor Party had returned to power nationally, the debate around financial deregulation, sale of the privatisation, the reduction on tariffs, the attack on industry policy, for instance, there were few dissenting voices. And the newfound electoral success suggested that those that did take that view should be marginalised. Then, of course, came the cultural wars, when, of course, the history wars, which have been referred to at length here, which are continuing through till today. We've seen, for instance, the 3 different campaigns to cut ARC grants. It's examples of that. Now, these have been actions that have seemed to portray the left and progressive politics generally as having taken a wrong turn in the 20th century. And throughout all of this, throughout all these debates about the role of government, about the role, the cultural role, about the values of this country, Stuart kept the flame alive. His public disputation helped legitimise the worldview that certainly I articulate, and which had become, in some circles, a view that was to be untenable. So let me quote from the Socialist Objective in response to the famous opening line of Paul Keating's victory speech, and it has been referred to briefly already. This was the victory of the true believers. Stuart said, "Who are the true believers?" Ever since the Labor Party's formation, there has been a struggle for the mantle of legitimacy. In the past decade, concerted defence of Labor's historical record was mounted from the fortresses of the right. The dominant note of the version of the Labor's history has been pragmatism. Under such circumstances, argument is both necessary and difficult. We can argue over ends and means, but without some larger awareness of the cause in which name the compromises are made, without the energy of doctrinal zeal, the cause withers. To celebrate the true believers is not enough. True believers need beliefs. In the past decade, especially since the beginning of the pandemic, the defects of neoliberal economics has gained, I think, an ascendancy. The ascendancy that was in fact developed in the 1980s has all become all too apparent. And the history wars, which I say have never ever subsided. We have gained an immense debate about the national curriculum and other matters. We've seen this notion of the unblemished triumph of conservatism. So we live in times where we're reminded of, again, of the challenge that was actually laid down back in 1993, that Stuart did articulate in that speech to the Labor Party National Conference. And it could be none more important than this forthcoming election. I think it would be pleasing that one of the places where people in the Labor Party now go to help them articulate those beliefs is Stuart's book on the Curtin and Chifley governments, Australia's Boldest Experiment. The lessons in that book are discussed, however, not just on the left, but on the right. And it's because of what Stuart achieved in his lifetime of advocacy as well as the historic scholarship, there is still a Labor Party that might emulate that bold experiment. Thank you very much.
And our last contribution is from Jeff Gallop, who again, in addition to a number of portfolio officers, of course, was Premier of Western Australia in the early years of this century.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Clem. I'd like to do the strange thing to start with, and that is to recognise the Noongar people of Western Australia, on whose land I've spent most of my life. And there's a wonderful print just out here of Aboriginal Western Australia at King George's Sound in 1834. Those who were at the beginning of this conference remember we had this little talk about federalism and consciousness related to one's position in a state versus another state. So I thought I'd inject that back into the occasion. I did walk out on a COAG meeting once because John Howard wouldn't respect the state of Western Australia and the particular problems it had vis-a-vis water. He said that's not an issue. The issue is the Murray-Darling, which of course it was a very important issue, but there was also one in Western Australia. I think Stuart learned a little bit when he was in Western Australia about the pride we have over there about our systems and our democracy. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But first of all, a big thank you to Joy, and where's Joy? Joy and Sean for organising, and to Clem for twisting my arm and saying, I think you should be participating in this. I've spent a lot of time in recent weeks reading as much as I can of Stuart's works, thinking about what they might represent. And I'll say a few things about that in this address this afternoon. But I do go back with Stuart a long time, and I was delighted to hear Martha talking yesterday about what it was like in England in the early 1970s, where indeed I was in Oxford and one of my friends lived in Cambridge, and there was this wonderful bus that went at 6 o'clock from Oxford, arrived in Cambridge at 9 o'clock, and then Sunday night it came back again. And I used to go up there quite often. And my friend said, you've got to meet some people at Martha and Stuart, you know. And that lovely little house they had in Cambridge and the activity that was going on. At that time, the left of the Labor Party through to some sort of anarcho-syndicalist approach. Every perspective of left-wing opinion was at the university, and I don't recall actually much about the Conservative Club at all at that time. So this was an incredible period of energy. Stuart, I think, and certainly I'd say Martha would have been in the same cat, a little bit bemused about where I was at the time politically, but I won't go into that matter, except to say that Uncle Leon played a significant role. Then, of course, Stuart came back to Murdoch. And briefly, I was there as well at that time. I was secretary of the Murdoch branch of the Labor Party, Kim, and is Kim still with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, there he is. Sorry, Kim. And I'm very proud to say that as secretary of the branch, Stuart became a new member, and that was the beginning of that long association with the ALP. Why did he make that shift from communism to the Labor Party? I think it was nailed by Kim. I can't imagine Stuart corralling himself with a democratic centralist organisation. You know, it just wasn't in his character or his personality to, and you see it, I'm just starting to read the party, you can see it very clearly there that he was a free thinker and this idea that you could corral. But also I think he understood that if you're a serious person, and serious people usually know something about Marxism, you've got to acknowledge at that time that the Labor movement and the ALP were very, very much brothers and sisters, more brothers than brothers and sisters, I acknowledge. But that was where the action was. And Jim, I think, nailed that one with his contribution. I have to tell a very little story, but he once took Rob Pascoe and myself, along with Manning Clark, on the 24th of April 1976. You all remember WA versus Victoria, and Manning Clark was heading north at the time because he wanted to go to I think it was Dirk-Hartog Island, because he wanted to take it in. He wanted to know what it was like for Dirk-Hartog to. But my other Manning Clark story, and I mentioned to Anna, I'd like to mention this. My early days in Oxford, the president of the St John's College was a man called Sir Richard Southern. Historians here would know he wrote The Magisterial Making of the Middle Ages. A very significant historian, a lovely man, very quietly spoken. And as you know, when the new students come, they have a sherry session, you know, we drink sherry and meet the president of the college. And I could see him, he wanted to come to me. And he came to me, he said, Jeff, I want to ask you something. I cannot understand, he said, the hostility to Manning Clark in Australia. I think he said the blackguards or the black arm, I can't remember the precise words, but these people, he said, they don't understand. Manning Clark is a genius. His understanding of the world, not only in Australian history, but bringing the perspective of the Enlightenment, he's in a different league. And he said, when I went over there, I discovered this hostility, political hostility. He wanted to know why it was. And I tried my best to explain that at the time, you know, Manning was being a little bit more political perhaps than he had been in the past. And that was unacceptable, you know, to sections of Australia. But there you go, Anna, he had that great support. I think he was a strong friend of Manning's as well. So, look, what I want to do is something a little bit different. First of all, I just want to say something about citizenship and the real support Stuart gave me, and I don't know, Kim may not be in the same camp on this one, when at the Constitutional Convention, I argued strongly for a sort of version of the Irish 1937 Constitution and for the direct election of what would become the President of Australia. And Stuart supported me on this. And I think it says something about, you know, that radical tradition we were talking about earlier. He really did have that idea that underpinning whatever socio-economic approach you might adopt, and he had a clear view on equality in that respect, but there's got to be this robust democracy underneath it all. Respect for people, involvement of people. And he was very keen. In fact, I pointed out to him that some of you would probably remember Emeritus Professor Victor Prescott, Melbourne University Geography. He wrote a lovely letter to Mike Rann and myself. We were both advocating for the direct election of the president. He wrote a really interesting letter to us on how that he agreed with that proposition and how we could make something of this institution that was uniquely Australian and different, and by getting people involved. And the election would not be like an election of the government of the day, but it would be a specific sort of election. I remember Stuart, who was very loyal, Victorian, if I might say, and a very loyal member of the Melbourne University, was delighted that Victor Prescott had written that letter. I remember that extremely well. But let's look at Stuart, and let me try and sort of understand what he might be saying about all of the things we've been talking about. And I'll spend a few minutes just saying that. First of all, Stuart, I think we have to say, was a leader. Why is it, you know, that whenever there was an issue, we'll ask Stuart, because he knew a lot. He was gracious with his time. He was a real leader. I used to say to my students, you put a group of people in a room in relation to a problem and someone will emerge in charge of the meeting. And remember that wonderful pamphlet, feminist pamphlet, The Tyranny of Structurelessness. It's a brilliant pamphlet. You should try get it off the web. You need structure, and there's always someone that's going to go in there and make it happen. And Stuart was a leader. And I think he also, and I'm told, Frank might have told me this, I don't know who did that, he was interested in meritocracy. Was it Frank? Or someone said that to me, that Stuart was taking up a real interest in meritocracy and you know, the great argument about what it meant and what it should mean and what it didn't mean, etc. You know, he respected expertise. He was an academic, and that's a really good thing, you know, that we need people who study. I used to say, I could go back to the Bodleian Library in Oxford now, and there'd be a historian sitting in a particular corner where he's been sitting for about 50 years, knowing everything about religion in 1645 or something. Real experts. And Stuart was one of them. He'd read everything. And so he knew a lot. And his image, I think, was he wanted the university and the people that were involved in it with all of that expertise to link up with, I'll use the word, the common people, to create a better society. Because the common people had an important role in all of this. They were the numbers in a democratic society, but also they organised themselves. And I think he could see in the Labor Party an instrument for his own views. Organisation and numbers, what a weapon. But you need the expertise. So here's my little take on Stuart's contribution and what it means to Labor today. Number one, if you look at the two periods of history that really he was very interested in, and we've talked about it, one was the colonial liberalism, and the other one was the post-war grand experiment of Curtin through to Chifley. And what marks those two things out? I may be wrong, and I hope we can start talking about this in a serious way, that there was an alliance between what you might call the middle-class radicals and the working people. Working people were taking time. They weren't fully organised at that point, but they had a common interest with the middle-class reformers, and it's called democracy. They had a common interest. And that common interest created an alliance. And that alliance delivered to working people over a period of 20 years. And as you know, 1890s, not so strong, early 20th century, that alliance that was developing between middle-class reformers and the Labor movement created all of those early governments. In Western Australia, the Scadden government, it was extraordinary, the reforms it introduced to create public enterprises as a competitive element to reduce prices and help consumers and whatever. Very, very radical change and a whole lot of working class conditions and whatever. And it was an alliance. Then, of course, his next one was post-war reconstruction. Again, Coombs, Deadman, those great public servants, expertise linked up with the Labor movement, encouraged then, in fact, by the Labor movement through Chifley and the Labor Party to create an Australia that was better for everyone. Again, they've got a common interest. They had a common interest in the late 19th, early 20th century in democracy. They had a common interest in and after the war in reconstruction and having a future people could believe in, a future of employment, all of those, you know, the great growth that occurred, and then the migrant factor that we've also became integrated a bit later on. So there's the alliance. What about today? The big one was the Hawke-Keating. Now, I think Stuart early on was probably a little bit more enthusiastic about the overall package that was the Hawke-Keating government. Was generally very, and I read the quote yesterday from the True Believers speech, where he talks in quite glowing terms about a lot of the reforms that were part of that. But he said, surely something new is in the making here. He quoted Gramsci, something new is in the making. He didn't quite know what it was. And now I think if he came back, I think he'd be more critical that the new Labor thing didn't happen. It didn't actually. It just, the circumstances were created. I'm getting the message. The circumstances were created such that, in fact, the Labor movement suffered as a result of a lot of those changes, both in terms of policy and also in terms of the numbers, because the Labor movement, you know, let's face it, it's in a much more powerless position now than it was back in the 1980s, early 1980s. So I think there's a story here that when there's an alliance between the middle class and the working class, or very general categories, and an alliance based on interest, the interest in democracy originally, the interest in rule, this is a real material interest. This is a real material interest. This isn't just an agreement between two sides who have a bit of a negotiation and say, you know, I'll believe in this, but you believe in that. There was an interest that put the two together. Now, that interest, really in the last 20 years hasn't been there. And you know, Labor's having this debate about, you know, is it middle class, is it too middle class, is it not working class enough? You know, this sort of debate's going on. And I think Stuart's approach to the history of political change, and again, I'm I'm going very, very generalizations here, I think would really enormously help us if he was around to be able to contribute to that discussion. And it's up to the historians here, I think, to take it up. So I'll finish on that note. I hope that makes sense, that proposition I put. You know, we need there has to be an interest between the two sides if they're really going to come together. I would have thought there is a big interest today because of the climate issue, because of its impact, and the need for a public sector that can do the job. I think we could start to establish that. But as Kim said, to do that, you've got to advocate for it. And this is the thing that Stuart, I think, would have also said about today. Where's the policy? Tanya Plibersek invited me to the caucus way back after I'd left the premiership and come over to Sydney University to talk about policy. Policy is a weapon. It's an unbelievable political weapon. And I illustrated, I hope, in my talk to the caucus, you know, how it can be used very effectively to build support so that when you stand up in the parliament and you've got a bill there, you know that behind you, you've got a movement. And it can be a very, very strong weapon. And I'm absolutely convinced that Stuart would be distressed about the story we heard from one of our earlier speakers, where Tanya, again, had organised a discussion of this, people on the mobile phones, you know, leaving the meeting, not concentrating, not really interested, because, you know, it's the next headline in the Sydney Morning Telegraph or whatever that matters. And so I hope that Stuart's legacy to us is to really get us in on that policy space that we absolutely need if we're going to advance the interests of